There is a problem with wealth inequality in this world. There needs to be a redistribution of wealth. Now, if you hear me saying these two key phrases, that there's wealth inequality and there needs to be a redistribution of wealth, there may be alarm bells going off for you right now, because this sounds all too familiar. This is the type of rhetoric that we see from certain political ideologies that I personally want nothing to do with. Political ideologies that are exploiting a real problem in order to expand the power of certain elites, certain institutions, and certain agendas. But I would say that the diagnosis of the symptoms, the fact that there is indeed wealth inequality and that there does need to be a redistribution of wealth, I think that is I agree with that basic premise. Now, why do I agree with this? Well, I'm coming from the perspective of someone who lives in the West, and from what I see, it's very clear that the working in the middle class is being drained of wealth, and they are being denied opportunities that in the past were taken as a birthright. In the West, depending on where you live, buying a house is now, for many people, all but impossible. And I view home ownership as a sort of litmus test for whether or not there is massive wealth inequality. Because if a person who works, who is productive, who contributes to society, I believe that a basic expectation for them should be that they own their own house. I think that's fair. And I think that should apply to factory workers, to warehouse workers, to low-skilled labor. I personally want to live in a society, in a nation, where if you're a hard worker, you are productive, that even if you are not highly skilled, that you still have the opportunity to own a house. Not a mansion, not a McMansion, but to own your dwelling. I think that's fair. I want to live in a society, in a nation where that is the basic, that's the sort of the social contract. Now, we are not even close to this being the case. I personally know of highly skilled workers who maintain the infrastructure that keeps civilization running, who maintain the type of infrastructure that if it were to fail or to collapse, millions would die. And they can't afford a house. They can't afford to own a house. Well, they may be able to put 5% down on a 30-year mortgage, in which the payment takes up, half their income. Maybe then they can, quote unquote, afford a house. But if that's the type of leverage that a highly skilled worker needs to have in order to quote unquote own a house, something is wrong. And I don't think it's and difficult to diagnose the problem or the problems that are leading to this wealth inequality. Obviously, the fiat currency system, fractional reserve banking, this is the root cause of this wealth inequality. We've covered this in detail on this channel. There's other reasons as well. In the context of the West, unrestricted free trade and globalization as a phenomenon in general, as an economic system, is also to blame for this. Now, this is kind of a controversial assertion to make in the Bitcoin space, because so many people that are into Bitcoin are libertarians or anarcho-capitalists, and they essentially believe in having no borders at all in terms of trade or even altogether. And I would say I don't agree with this. The problem with having unrestricted free trade, the problem with globalization from the perspective of someone who lives in the West, let's say a blue-collar worker, is, well, now you are subject to compete with what amounts to slave labor. So if the labor in your nation is subjected to competition with labor in a country like China, where they treat laborers like cattle, like slaves, well, it's very difficult over the long run to maintain the purchasing power of wages if the competition is willing to treat workers like slaves, because it's a race to the bottom. Obviously, international corporations are going to opt to use the cheapest labor, and if the cheapest labor is effectively working at for slave wages, well, you have just subjected your workers in your nation to having to compete with slave labor. Well, you can't compete with slave labor. You can't compete on a labor market when your competitor is willing to treat labor or laborers like slaves and pay them like slaves. You can't compete with that. So if you subject your workers to that dynamic, and that's what we see with globalization, well, guess what? The real purchasing power of wages is just going to trend down until it meets the level of your competition, which in this case is effectively slave labor. And that's what we see. In the West, we see the real purchasing power of wages in terminal decline for decades. That's what happens when you have unrestricted free trade, and that's what happens when you embrace globalization. So there is many reasons why, from the context of, from the perspective of being in the West, this is one of the reasons why there is this wealth inequality. Wages are in decline, in terminal decline, because of open borders, because of offshoring, because of globalization. We have central banks that the thing with printing money is that it's going to inflate asset prices like real estate. And that's good if you already own a house. But if you are just trying to scrape together a down payment and your ability to save is vastly outpaced by the rise in housing prices, then owning a house just becomes progressively more and more out of reach. It becomes a dream that, regardless of how hard you work, just becomes impossible to attain. So there's something wrong here. There's something wrong in the economy, and we know what it is. But I think the problem politically becomes, if you acknowledge this problem, how do you address it? How do you fix it? Redistribution of wealth is a really difficult nut to crack, because it's really easy for certain groups or ideologies to hijack a problem and exploit it for their own agendas. It is really easy to turn a solution into a nightmare, to turn a solution into the problem. And redistribution of wealth is a really, really dangerous political proposition, because it is just fraught with opportunity for exploitation, for abuse, for tyranny. Redistribution of wealth is a political agenda that can lead to outright genocide. So I recognize that a call for the redistribution of wealth is inherently, or at least potentially, dangerous. But we do have this problem. We do have this wealth inequality. We do have this decline in the ability for the working and middle class to accumulate wealth, to accumulate, not to become rich, but to have a standard of living that I think every hardworking individual deserves in a society or in a nation. And to the extent that they are not able to attain this, that's a problem. And if that problem is not addressed, it leads to certain extreme outcomes. When you have a pressure cooker with no release valve, and the pressure just builds and builds and builds, eventually it is going to explode. And if you have extreme wealth inequality and declining standard of living, and the inability for the working and middle class to accumulate enough wealth that they can feel that they have a stake in the society, that they can feel like they are part of a healthy nation. To the extent that they are denied this, the pressure is going to build. And one way or another, it is going to be released. So this is a critical issue that needs to be addressed. You can't ignore it. This issue needs to be fixed. There needs to be a redistribution of wealth. How do we do this without resorting to confiscation? This is the essence of the problem, because as soon as your political agenda is to confiscate wealth and redistribute it, now this is where things get dangerous, because how do you decide who to confiscate it from and how much to confiscate? And what if they don't agree to it? This is the essence of why political schemes for the redistribution of wealth end in violence and political disintegration, chaos and war and revolution. Because redistribution of wealth through force is going to be met with force. What's the solution? Well, I think you know where I'm going to go with this. Bitcoin.